fashion-conscious, high-ranking member of any society, be it political, social, or scientific, you know that your attire and general presentment determine how seriously you are taken by those around you. How no right-minded individual with authority, influence, and power is going to allow themselves to make an appearance looking like some unkempt, disheveled mess. And neither would you. That's why you need to make your next clothing purchase at Masculine's Robe Emporium. Our store offers a fine selection of robes, tunics, doublets, jerkins, breeches, overgowns, and so much more. Make sure all eyes are firmly upon you whenever you're making a presentation, giving a lecture, or just shouting to no one in the middle of a crowded street. Everything in our wardrobe is available in the most ostentatious, garish, and downright absurd patterns which will leave anyone you cross paths with astounded and envious. Stars, moons, wolves howling at moons, flames, all of it can be included on your newest apparel when you buy from Masculine's Robe Emporium. Use the code MASON when placing your next order and we'll include a large wizard hat and wand that will make you the talk of the town. Masculine's Robe Emporium, outlandish outfits for the astute and aloof. And you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I am one of the co-hosts.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
Unfortunately, Will is not able to join us for our recording today, so we are just the three of us, and as a result, we also don't have Will's usual summary, unfortunately, but we're going to make do with the Wikipedia summary. So we are we're following the reading schedule from the Pynchon subreddit, and today we're discussing chapters 74 through 78 of Mason and Dixon, the final chapters, the final part of the book. And so we're going to limit this conversation to those chapters only, and we will have a capstone episode that covers the entire book next week. But for this episode, we're just going to be focusing on chapters 74 through 78. So, Kate, if you would please give us the summary on those chapters.
Sure. Chapters 74 through 78 comprise part 3 of the book, entitled Last Transit. And in chapter 74, Mason and Dixon return to London, where they decline for various possible reasons to accept another assignment together. Dixon is sent to the North Cape, Norway, to observe the transit of Venus, while Mason is sent to Ireland to do the same. There, he is conscripted into helping deal with peat flow, given to temperamental behavior, and visited again by Rebecca. Upon his return to London, he argues with Masculine, who assures him their office is no longer what it once was, and accepts another assignment to travel to Scotland. In episode 75, Mason visits Dixon, who is now home from his assignment, on his way north to Scotland. The two friends fish and drink, admitting finally the strength of their relationship without quite putting it into words. Dixon relates to Mason his trip to the North Cape, and claims to have visited the civilization inside the Earth, entering through the North Pole, one of the many openings to a massive hollow chamber with upside-down seas. The episode then concludes with Mason promising to visit again, Dixon being unable to travel, having come down with a case of gout. In episode 76, Mason meets Samuel Johnson at an inn on the border of Scotland, a meeting dismissed as fictitious by Cherrycoke's audience. And the two discuss Scotland and America, as well as men like Cherrycoke and Johnson's biographer, James Boswell, who are always, quote, scribbling things down, unquote. The brief episode ends with a vision of Mason's later life. And in episode 77, Mason visits Dixon, who is recently married and suffering from gout still. Dixon laments that the recent death of his mother and the political turbulence in America have forced him to abandon his hopes of emigration. deciding instead to profit from Britain's growing coal dependency. Mason, himself now remarried, confesses that his newborn son unpleasantly resembles his father, who has himself remained a Mary. The learned English dog makes another appearance, though he refrains from speech except to declare that he will next visit when the two surveyors are together once again. The two men share a dream of a performance where, in Mason's version, he attempts to introduce Dixon to Bradley, whilst Dixon envisions a duet based on their adventures. In episode 78, upon hearing of Dixon's death, Mason and his son, Dr. Isaac, make a pilgrimage to his grave reminiscent of the journeys the two surveyors previously embarked upon together. The learned English dog fails to make a bodily appearance. However, a cat lurks around Dixon's grave with a keen interest in the two Masons. Slipping into senility, Mason finally lets Maskelyne have it, as the two engage in a heated squabble over astrology and the events after Bradley's passing. Mason, now settled in America, is visited by the elderly Benjamin Franklin, who is accosted by rantings of Mason in regards to hidden messages in Bradley's contentious observations. Mason's second wife, Mary, prays for her husband and returns to England with their younger children, while Dr. Isaac and William, Rebecca's sons, stay in America and see out their father's final days. The story ends as the two brothers reminisce on how they, as boys, always wished for the day their father would take them to America.
All right, thank you for that. So we'll start where we always start, with our general impressions of these chapters.
There are portions of these chapters that I like. I like the reuniting of Mason and Dixon, and I like the sort of final admission that they care about each other to the degree that they do. I love all of that. I love the additional expansion of the Hollow Earth. I love the closing chapter where Mason kind of finally breaks out of his self-contained shell a bit and finally works out sort of not just some frustration that he's had over the course of the entire book, especially as he's been continually denied membership to the Royal Society, but also finally sort of stands up for himself in a way that he hasn't over the course of the book. And so all of the stuff in that final discussion between Maskelyne and Mason I enjoyed. But the rest of these chapters I feel like are more filler. Like everything with Mason and his son, and like chapter 78 is great, I think. I think 77 is largely pretty good. I don't think 76 is really necessary 75 I think is also very important with everything, and then 74 is sort of that transitory chapter. But I don't know, I feel like these are very mixed bag chapters for me, and that there are elements of all of them that I think are great, but overall I feel like these didn't need to be the length that they were.
That's fair. I would definitely say these aren't my favorite chapters.
Mm-hmm.
There's some really, as you said, there's some really, really good parts in here. I actually, on to kind of counter what you had mentioned earlier, I really actually enjoyed the scenes with Mason and his son. And I think maybe that partially stems from being a father and from having a father who was similar to Mason's. So I kind of, I have a more deep personal connection with that aspect of his life, and that, his valuation of his time with his son at the end of his life.
Those parts of the chapters I did enjoy. I did.
Okay. I misunderstood you then. I'm sorry. But yeah, 74, 75, like they're good, and 76 too. They're good, but yeah, they could have been shorter. They definitely weren't. I don't know that I would say they were the weakest chapters in the whole book, but if I really thought about it, they might be. That's not necessarily they're not bad by any means.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think they were. I don't even want to say they weren't necessary. They just could have really been. I think pared down is where I'm landing on that. But other than that, the ending, the final scenes with Mason and Dixon, and we'll go more in depth on this when we get there, but that was some of the just the most beautiful writing throughout this whole book. They were, subtle and very effective. And this is, like I said, the second time I've read this book, and it's the second time I have cried while reading this book. So.
Yeah, it's understandable. It's very heavily emotional, if nothing else, over the course of these last 4 chapters.
Yeah, I agree with you all that I think these chapters could have been pared down a bit. I especially struggled with, I think it was 74. My reading comprehension on that one wasn't amazing. Even stuff like the Hollow Earth section is really good. I liked it a lot. It's just not super fleshed out. I could have used a chapter or two just of that instead of some of the more kind of arcane stuff that we get into. There's a lot of like historical names thrown at you in these chapters. And yeah, it's a little bit bloated, I would say. There is some cool stuff. Like I said, the Hollow Earth thing, which I have some stuff planned to talk about with that. And then the ending, I love the ending of this book. The last about page and a half. It doesn't really get much better than that, in my opinion. I feel like it's I don't know how else he could have ended this book. It's not necessarily, if you'd asked me what the final page of this book would look like, I wouldn't necessarily have told you that 2 minor characters would be talking to one another in a sort of flashback. And that, that doesn't, like, when you summarize it like that, it doesn't sound appealing, and it doesn't necessarily it doesn't summarize well. But it's really good. It's a really like emotional and sentimental ending that I think kind of sets the tone for everything that came before it in a lot of ways. People talk about how warm this book is, how this book is a lot about family and friendship and fatherhood in different ways, and it's kind of the experience of being a man in terms of emotions and connections to other people and stuff. I'm not the biggest fan of this last section, like y'all, but I can't think of a better way to end this book than 2 children kind of talking about the kind of mythical nature of America, especially in that time period, in a way that doesn't scan as at all. Like it doesn't read as super like it's not belabored. It's not like it doesn't seem like it's trying too hard, which Pynchon can kind of come across like that at times. But it's very subtle. I this time reading through it, it definitely made me think of how we've kind of traced Pynchon's views on fatherhood, and some of the jokes we've gone over as they relate to Pynchon's relationship with his son. And it definitely reminds me of, it kind of makes me think that this whole book is half a love letter to Richard Farina and half a love letter to Pynchon's son.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I don't know. I think that I'm going to say the controversial thing and say that I don't find this ending very satisfying. Like, I think that the thematic intent of the ending is satisfying from a standpoint of, like, Mason himself has sort of broken this generational cycle with his children, and they are choosing to stick with him, and all of the stuff about America, I think, is very well earned or very well encapsulated there. I don't know if the proper amount of, I don't know if maybe the term would be setup work, is done for this to have the punch that you would want it to have. Because these characters re-enter the story sort of out of nowhere in these last 4 or 5 chapters, and then we spend a huge amount of time with them, and at the very end are sort of expected to have this this very intense reaction to their final words. Like, the spirit of what Pynchon is doing, I think, is really there. But because of how much of the bulk of this book deals specifically with Mason and Dixon, I don't know if it was necessarily the best choice from a standpoint of ending this book in a satisfying manner to not have it end with Mason attending Dixon's funeral and then sort of choosing to find his sort of next path in life. I don't know. I feel like that would have been potentially a more satisfying conclusion to what this book represented from the actual size of the material here and what it surrounds. I certainly enjoyed the ending, but it did not feel the same way that books like Lot 49 or Gravity's Rainbow or, even Inherent Vice or Bleeding Edge feel in their ending. I was hoping for something a bit more than I think what I got.
So I want to dig into that a little bit more before we start covering the chapters themselves. Do you feel that it would have been a more satisfying and complete ending if it had ended at the scene where Mason visits Dixon's grave and just kind of left out those last, like, what is it, 4.5 pages?
Yeah, I think so. I think that would have been the kind of, because this book is ultimately about Mason and Dixon. Like, all of the stuff that is present in the book in relation to Mason and his relationship with his children, and all of that are there. And I don't want to say that they're not, and that Pynchon hasn't done the work to bring that to a conclusion. I feel like he did, but I feel like he did that in chapter 74, when Mason realizes the error of his ways and how he is creating this, or rather sustaining this curse between fathers and sons that runs in his family, and chooses to undo that by not taking another assignment to Dixon, choosing to go back home, and choosing to actually involve himself with his kids again. I feel like that is the perfect conclusion to that whole subplot with Mason's character and his development over the course of the 700 pages. I feel like bringing that back around with them talking to each other in sort of the last days of Mason's life, I don't see how that would be a better ending to this book than the ending of the relationship between the two titular characters. That, I think, would make much more sense, because I feel like, to my earlier point, I feel like Pynchon already closed out that thematic through line of Mason and his children.
I see where you're coming from. I'm not. I can't say that. I can't say you're wrong. I mean, obviously, it's an opinion, and there's no way to sit here and say it's objectively one thing or the other.
Right.
But you bring up a good point, and it's one that I think merits discussion. And I as much as I do love the last probably full page, if you were to put it on the same page, the last little section of the book itself, I wouldn't want that changed at all. I do think that final little section there is really beautifully done, and it's a great ending. I wouldn't object to that being the end right after Mason visits Dixon's grave. I think there's an argument to be made there that would probably be a more satisfying conclusion. Mm-hmm. But I think also it, because it really, if anything, this section, this whole last transit section is almost like a coda to everything else. And so it parts of this, like Luke mentioned, the Hollow Earth, all the Hollow Earth stuff, and I really liked those parts, but I really genuinely kind of felt like those could have been included. Like, you could probably take parts of this ending and have put them elsewhere towards the end of part 2, and it may have balanced that out a little bit more and made this last section a little bit thinner, but still managed to include some of those things. I know timeline wise, some of that couldn't have happened, but I don't know. It's a real mixed bag for me with this last section. I feel like it's a good conclusion, but not a perfect one.
Yeah,
It's perfectly flawed is maybe the best way I can. You know what it reminds me of? I was thinking of today is the ending of Magnolia, where this whole long, that's a 3 hour and 15-minute movie, and it builds it's just steamrolling through the whole plot for the first probably 2 hours and 45 minutes, and then the final part after for anyone who hasn't seen it, you've had almost 20 years, go watch it. After the frogs come down, it feels like the movie slows down, but the ending speeds up. And while it does end on a good note, just like this does, like that final scene of Claudia looking at the camera and smiling is, I think, the perfect way to end that. Just as the last section of chapter 78 is the perfect little ending for this. I do think that that last act could have used some trimming and would have been a lot better if it had that.
Yeah, or just it maybe doesn't even necessarily need trimming, but maybe just rearranging. Because to your point, Cody, I think that those last couple pages and like that closing dialogue between the children, like none of that is poorly written or ill-conceived or anything like that. I just don't know if it functions with the impact he's hoping it does. Whereas, yeah, if it was pushed up to being at Dixon's grave and kind of, because if you set that whole scene at Dixon's grave, right, you've already established in chapter 74 that Mason is moving on from his largely deficient parenting up to that point in his life, and that he's going to actually engage with his kids and try and be there for them. If you set that scene at Dixon's gravesite, you have the true death of what for the last almost 10 years has kept him from his children, that being the character of Dixon. And then you have the decision from his kids then to also reaffirm themselves to him. And I think it would work much better to the suggestion you had if they were taking place one and the same. And I feel like that would feel a bit more like probably what Pynchon was going for. And if you want to still include all the stuff with Benjamin Franklin and Flat Earth and all of that, or Hollow Earth, not Flat Earth, just move that up before all of that. So yeah, I don't know if necessarily, and maybe this is a case where it did need to be cut out, but I feel like there's a way that it could be kept but rearranged for it to feel the way Pynchon wants it to feel. Is kind of my last word on it, I think.
Luke, do you have any thoughts on this?
Not really. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with y'all like vehemently. I don't, it's not a perfect ending. It's not, Gravity's Rainbow, now everybody.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably Pynchon's best ending, although I'm kind of blanking on how some of the other novels end. I do like that there's a set, like in Crying of Block 49, we don't necessarily get a lot, and I like this about that book, but we don't get a lot of resolution, or there's not a lot of catharsis at the end. And I do think that this book at least attempts to give the reader catharsis.
That it does.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. Well, let's I guess we can come back to that maybe at the end, but for now, let's kind of dive into these chapters one at a time here. So, starting with chapter 74, we kind of already touched on it a little bit, but I think the biggest part of this chapter is, and which comes back around at the end, obviously, is Mason's decision and realization that he doesn't want to follow in his father's footsteps and continue that cycle of I hesitate to use the word neglect, but that's really what it is, bordering on it. It's, his father was emotionally neglectful, and when he was there, he was emotionally abusive and manipulative. And Mason clearly sees that on page 718, where he talks, there's the paragraph, how could the elder Charles have forgiven Mason for leaving his children with his sister, dumping them really, going off to the Indies with another man, another stargazer, coming home only to turn about and sail off to America with the same man? Dixon sees the pattern, the expectation, the coming transit of Venus. Mason sees it too. If we went off a third time together, he hates me enough already. I study the stars against my father's wish. But do I remain among them only at the price of my sons? That is what I face, some choice. So he declines the North Cape and another posting together, symmetrically as ever, to that end of the world lying opposite of their first end of the world. Someone must break this damned symmetry, Mason mutters. So he clearly sees, what he's done, and I think he has seen it, when he left for America. He was struggling with that decision, but ultimately made the choice to go. And while I don't think he regrets that, I do think if he had chosen to go on that planned trip, that would have probably just been too much for him, too much for his family, could have had, devastating impact on them. So he made what I would say for him, for his character, was definitely the right choice.
Oh yeah, completely. And I think a lot of that is, I think part of it is also coming from the catharsis of the previous chapters, in which he's kind of finally realized that his mopery over Rebecca is getting him nowhere. And that now that he's sort of processed that, it really recalled the scenes from earlier in the book when he couldn't look at his son because he looked like Rebecca. And so I feel like there is also something in his decision to return that he's finally gotten over Rebecca. He doesn't need Rebecca anymore, but he can still have Rebecca in his children that he's had with her, which I feel like is really well encapsulated by the ending, in which it's the two children that he had with Rebecca who decide to stay with him. So I feel like there is also something to be said for the fact that he does this after he finally gets all of his, I'll say, melancholia out of his system that he's been affected by for so long with the passing of his first wife.
Yeah, Mason, and this isn't something that we focused on really at all, and that's not necessarily, it's neither here nor there, but Mason definitely does exhibit, pretty classic signs of clinical depression. I would even perhaps go so far as to say that I don't like doing this, especially to what amounts to fictional characters. But I do myself have some experience with bipolar disorder and manic depression, and there are some perhaps aspects of that. Seen through a modern lens, he keeps hearing his dead wife's voice. He sees her ghost. If you were to tell that to a psychiatrist nowadays, you might get a diagnosis thrown on you.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely, that's neither here nor there, I guess, in a lot of ways, but his depression is a pretty key aspect of his character. And that definitely comes through at least some in these final chapters. I think it's stated that in his last 7 years, his melancholia didn't decrease; it only increased, despite the fact that he got remarried and had a bunch of kids. I don't necessarily know where I was going with that, but it is an interesting aspect of his character that he is so melancholic and so prone to depression, and yet he did accomplish a lot with his life as well.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a good point, because as as someone who I myself was diagnosed with depression a long time ago, and I think it's portrayed pretty well in Mason. It's never really explicitly stated that that's his situation, but obviously that also was not a diagnosable condition at that time. But he does clearly exhibit the symptoms, and I think what this particular part of his arc shows about that is that depression doesn't really go away. You just have to find ways to work with it and to readjust your life to to allow yourself to do certain things. And that's something I think Mason throughout this book is learning, is that he, at some point, yes, he does have to let go of Rebecca, and whether or not he remarries is totally up in the air for him, but he does have to allow himself to let go of that and to stop letting it, create such a burden on his life. And he does finally let go of it, but it's not necessarily, it's not going to be this, weight off my shoulders, the whole world is open to me now kind of thing. It's more of just, that part of it is gone, and he can move forward with his life despite still, he's still going to have that melancholy. He's still going to have those times of sadness and depression and all that, but he at least made this big step, and that's something that I think was good for him as a character.
Yeah, I agree. I really feel like the elements of chapter 74 provide a really great capstone to Mason as a character. And I think that it sort of is half done in 74, and then the other half is done in 77 or 78, wherever it is that he has the shouting match with Masculine, where you kind of where you have Mason resolving his home life with Rebecca in 74. In 78, you have him resolving his professional work and finally, rising to defend himself, albeit way too late in his life. Mm-hmm. That you sort of, I think, have one lead to the other. That his absolute state of depression from the death of Bradley and the death of Rebecca and the loss of that house that they all lived in together and that period of his life, and then not ever being chosen as Bradley's replacement, much less being admitted to the Royal Society, and then, getting what was kind of like crap work for so long. You can see how that builds and builds and builds and leads him to be the melancholic person he is for most of this book. And then finally, when he's able to resolve sort of the seed germ of it, the loss of his family, he's able to push forward and resolve the other portions of it as well, or at least do what he can to.
Well, and the other thing that stays with Mason is the realization of his complicity in a lot of the horrible things that went on in America, specifically the slavery, and that comes up in his dream right after the mention of his decision to stay, mm-hmm. where we see him, having this dream of going to God, I just blanked on the name. Is it North Cape? Yeah, North Cape, and he sees this group of enslaved people, and he just is unable to do anything other than just kind of observe it, and so it's clear that it's still haunting him. Which is understandable, because to witness those kind of atrocities would have to stay with someone,
Yeah, definitely. Well, and especially given how much of it he has experienced now, like between his time in part 1 dealing with the slaves of the Dutch East India Company, and then all through America and the horrors of it that they saw everywhere there, and eventually leading to Dixon's outburst towards the end of the America section. And there's probably part of him that was just hoping, I'm away from that now. I'm in a place where I believe slavery was abolished in the United Kingdom at this point. Like, I'm away from where this is something that I should be seeing or experiencing. And then suddenly he just sees it again. And all like that, there, yeah, exactly. And that has to prompt some significant thoughts like the ones that he has.
Yeah, and to go back to the Rebecca thing, something I wanted to bring up today was, there does seem to be a recurring theme of the absent lover who the main character seems to pine for, or miss, or the person leaving a hole in somebody's life. In Lot 49. Oedipus spends the entire time basically obsessed with her former lover, mm-hmm. Pierce. In Vineland, Zoid repeatedly shows how he's not over his ex, whose name I'm blanking on. Mason, Mason's perhaps defining characteristic in this book is number 1, he's a astronomer, and number 2, he really misses his dead wife. Those are kind of the the two main character traits he carries through this entire book. Even in Inherent Vice, which I recently rewatched the movie the other day, Doc, spends all this time searching for and helping his ex-girlfriend, who kind of dips in and out of the narrative and is absent through a lot of it, and had been absent for a long time. Which is interesting to think about. I do kind of wonder where that comes from. Even for an author that we might know more about, I'm not sure that we would actually know where that would come from, but it does seem to be a recurring theme for Pynchon. I could probably pull out examples from other books as well, but I did find that interesting to think about, that kind of through line through his work, of the absent romantic partner, the romantic partner who leaves a hole in the main character's life.
That's a good point. And I'm wondering if I don't know that it would be something personal for him necessarily, because he's been married, I think, since like 1990, at least around the time Vineland came out.
I think it might have been early 80s. Yeah,
it might have even been earlier than that. It could just be that, in all fairness, like, that's just a good plot device. It's a good way to motivate the main character and to kind of push them through the plot. So it could just be something as simple as that.
Yeah.
If you know how to write it, keep doing it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I found was, I felt like this was a very cathartic chapter for Mason. But it also circled back around onto a lot of his struggles. And the other one that came up was the specific line on page 719, where he's talking about, he writes this really nice little blurb in his about the bog, but then he mentions right after that Masculine will edit this out, which is why Mason leaves it in his field report. So he's still struggling with with Masculine, just hovering over him and continuing to assert his presence in his life and kind of stand in the way of his own success and interests. So I can't help but feel bad for him, because he just doesn't really seem to get, he can't catch a break. The guy just gets, all kinds of downer stuff thrown at him, and he's doing the best he can. And then something like this comes along, which seems trivial, but it's, for Mason, that's a huge thing.
Well, and some of the funniest stuff in these chapters is all of the absurd things that Mason tries to put into his reports and letters.
Yeah.
That like, I don't know if it was necessarily purposeful, but it feels like Mason is continually trying to escalate the absurdity of the things that he's saying, just because he knows that Masculine's going to have to address it with him. And it's almost like him getting some kind of power back in that relationship, that he's forcing this guy that he let's just be honest, kind of hates, to have to read out these absurd things that he's writing in for the purpose of having them edited out. Like, every time we return to that motif or joke or whatever you'd want to call it by, it always made me laugh so hard, like the actual quotations that are in there. Some of them are truly crazy. Yeah.
It makes me wonder if that is, as we've mentioned before, I think there are so many little just authorial self-inserts throughout this book, and I have to wonder if that's, if Pynchon has done similar things where he just puts these outlandish parts or lines in his books just to kind of poke his editor.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially if, I don't remember who brought up this idea, but especially if sort of Mason and Dixon also sort of represents the creation process of a novel, then this would certainly be another piece of like supplementary evidence to support that idea with, of the editing process of someone looking at your work or your novel and be like, yeah, you can't print this. Like, there's no way that this will fly. Which I wish I had been proactive and taken down those quotations, because they're so funny.
Yeah, I don't know that I actually highlighted them. I just remember chuckling at them when I was reading them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so going back to the idea of the authorial self-insert, I couldn't help but feel that the mention on page 720 about Maskelyne's letter and or his response letter to Mason, and the fact that none of Mason's letters could ever be located, was and that was an interesting section, because you have, you know, the mention of it, and then there's the line, make something up then Munchausen would, which I love that line and that inclusion of Baron Munchausen in there. But that really, you could kind of see that as, you know, Pynchon's taken essentially Mason's journal and used that as a very rough kind of outline, and then from that just fleshed out this whole story, this whole world, where he really can do just about anything, because there's so little to actually, you know, historically to go off of, that he can pepper in these stories and these events and all these kind of things that, you know, you can say happen, and you can frame it as, you know, Cherry Coke's telling the story where he's the one telling the story, and, you know, we go back to the frame and the frame and the frame and the frame kind of thing. And I just felt like this was another one of those little nods of like, yeah, I'm basically just having fun with history and just kind of filling in these gaps that I have the ability to fill in.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the broader point about how we arrive at the understanding of history that we have. In, you know, obviously that's a big thematic point of the book overall, is this is, you know, a fictionalized version of a real thing, and yet within the fictionalized version you have a man narrating events he wasn't there for and may or may not be sensationalizing them, and then it also crosses over with literal in-universe fiction in the Ghastly Fop sections. So, like, obviously Pynchon is doing a lot of work there, but he's also bringing in something from the real world, these missing letters that probably are truly missing. Like, we don't have much on either of these people. We have Mason's journal from the drawing of the line, but not much else. So I think it's just another additional sort of acknowledgement that, you know, if we had all of this information, maybe your understanding would be different, but it's been quote unquote lost, whether or not that was on purpose or on accident. Right. And so now we are stuck with the version of things that we have. You know, maybe Mason acknowledged the existence of a mechanical duck somewhere in his letters.
Maybe that's why they had to hide them. We weren't ready for that technology yet.
Exactly. And then we would have potentially an entirely different reading of how that story comes to conclude in these chapters.
Well, speaking of the mechanical duck, we do get one last scene with Armand. And I wanted to get y'all's opinion on this. With the way that Armand is described, it's, you know, 'tis the very Frenchman, is it not? Yet why then is his figure illuminated so much less than everything else about this time of day? Why is he moving so smoothly as a boat upon still water, looming ever closer, aiming? It now becomes apparent. A kiss at Mason's cheek, his color at close range aberrating toward green as he sweeps in a cold wind upon and past the shivering Mason with an echo like an odor trailing after. Do you think it's? I kind of took it as, you know, just this sort of, I guess, melancholy of having lost the duck, and which had kind of become his whole. You know, he kind of built his life around that in a way.
Yeah, they mate for life, Cody.
Yeah,
the
I know. So yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to bring up, is the inclusion of some of these characters that come back with Armand, and then later we have potentially Fang comes back through. We get the return of Maskelyne. Do y'all feel that these inclusions were natural, or did they feel kind of forced in?
So that's a good question. I don't think I necessarily saw them as forced. I think I saw them as a delineation between the world that Mason and Dixon came from and the world that Mason and Dixon went into in America, as this idea that they are sort of two separate places, not just from a standpoint of like geography, but also from a thematic perspective. This idea that when they're out in this sort of Edenic wilderness that is full of, you know, perfect verdant hills and these beautiful landscapes, and it's been untouched by modernity past a certain point where the colonies have spread, you don't have connections to the elements of the modern world from where you came. The Royal Society doesn't have a grip on you. Masculine can write letters or maybe send instruments, as he does towards the end of their time in America, which is based on real history. But largely you're not connected to that anymore because you're away from it. And same thing would be the case with like Fang. You know, there's a dog that they assume can talk, but that they're not able to confirm while they're there. They kind of just assume that this dog can also talk. But then, you know, to your point, as soon as you step back into that world in these last, you know, because really 74, they're still in America for a portion of it. So 75, 76, 77, and 78, you've returned to that world. And now all of a sudden, all this stuff is here again. These evolutionary characteristics in dogs, this, you know, all-seeing eye of the Royal Society, and it's constantly hounding Mason again, and Masculine is potentially abusing his position as Astronomer Royal that he may or may not have come by dishonestly. So I think it almost is supposed to mark that shift from returning from this sort of paradise back into something that is inherently more complicated and probably less desirable.
Yeah, I totally agree. I can see how people might come away thinking that those characters coming back feels a little bit shoehorned, but I think honestly, they make sense. Their appearances in these chapters occur naturally. I think you make the argument that Fang isn't really even Fang. At this point, they just think any dog that they come across can talk. So, you know, and we never really, I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's explicitly stated that it's Fang. It's just implied that it is, and they certainly think it is. So, you know, and then Armand has just kind of popped up everywhere. You know, he's almost anytime there's a scene where there's a kitchen in there, Armand is
spreading the
there.
gospel of those sandwiches.
That's right.
And I do love when he reappears that he almost kind of is described as pouncing out of nowhere at Mason once he sees him again.
Yeah,
It's just overjoyed to see this man again.
Like it reminds me of Calvin and Hobbes whenever Calvin comes home and Hobbes is hiding somewhere.
Yeah,
just jumps on him.
That's a great analog.
I did a little bit of research on bog bursts. I don't know if y'all knew what those were. I had no idea. So the link on the Pinchon wiki is broken for that particular definition. So I had to go and Google it. It's basically a landslide, but it is. And I thought this was interesting that it's specifically it's a bog burst because bog bursts are considered more often to be caused by human activity. So rather than a landslide, which is often caused by natural forces, you know, heavy rains or just the land shifting or anything like that, these are specifically caused by building, by excavation, or peat harvesting. So it kind of ties it into the general theme of how, you know, by doing everything that we have done, we being not just Mason and Dixon, but everybody who interacts with the land in any way, shape, or form, it kind of ties back into that of, you know, this is a man-made occurrence, and this event has happened because of human activity. So even coming back to the UK, you know, he's still not getting away from the impact that he's having on the land. Not to say that he specifically did it, but
well, I mean, and that is also reinforced by Rebecca coming and speaking to him, where she's like, you think you found their sacred well, I think is wording of what it is.
Holy well, I think. Holy well.
Holy well, yes. Yeah. But she says in reality it's just a like imitation of it. This idea that like they did they caused this thing to happen. And everybody is sort of amazed at the outflow that it has, but ultimately it isn't anything more than human interference, to your point, Cody, which continues to build on these themes that Pinchon has been orbiting in of sort of human intervention and destruction of land and all of that. And now it's being confirmed by someone who lives in the spirit realm. if Rebecca is literally a ghost instead of just sort of his brain's processing of loss. So I think you're exactly on the money there as far as that means.
On the subject of holy wells, I did want to. This is a bit of an aside, but I recently read M. John Harrison's "The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again," which is a really good novel. I think from 2020. It reads like a pension novel, but like written by, say, like Joseph McElroy or J.G. Ballard.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's about like these two different characters who are both like on the edge of this really, really odd conspiracy. And they're not, it's a very like understated, but it does have a lot to do with like British folklore and Brexit and stuff like that. But there is the concept, like the holy well thing kind of comes up in that there are like some like supernatural happenings involving water and like swamps in England occur, and there's kind of, because the Pension Wiki describes the holy well as like a piece of water or a section of some type of water that is important to local folklore, and that definitely does come up in that book, which I do highly recommend. That book, I also read M. John Harrison's other book, Light, which I think is probably top 10 novels I've ever read. So he comes highly recommended for me, at least. But yeah, that does come up in that book.
That's interesting. I might have to check that one out.
Yeah, I know M. John Harrison wrote some science fiction books that have gotten included in like the SF Essentials imprint. So that was mainly the work that I knew him for, but that sounds like a very interesting book.
The other thing I wanted to bring up, or rather, I guess the last thing I wanted to bring up for chapter 74 is I wanted to get y'all's opinions on the rivalry between Masculine and Mason. We have Cherry Coke is kind of described as seeing it as he refers to it as brotherly, which I think is a good term, but I don't know if it's the right one.
No.
And then Euphronia definitely sees it as being more nefarious, which is where I land on that side of it. I definitely think Masculine is really using his power and his clout to kind of lord over Mason as much as possible. Excuse me, as much as possible.
Yeah, I think Mason has maybe a brotherly relationship with Cherry Coke, or certainly Dixon.
Absolutely,
but I would say that the relationship between Masculine and Mason is anything but brotherly. I would be very interested if there was any chapters considered for inclusion here that show the relationship from Masculine's perspective, because I feel like it would be very different from Mason.
Oh, for sure.
I think that he would view Mason more as a like his young ward, so to speak, that he's trying to like help increase the capabilities of and like make into a better astronomer. But it's very clear that Mason hates him, like not just from a standpoint of his very explicit words about him when they're doing the survey at the beginning of the book, but also everything in these chapters and everything about Mason's character would really go to speak that Masculine is someone that he started hating when he was given the position of Astronomer Royal, because it was probably just sort of an uneasy dislike prior to that, like, oh, that guy's kind of weird, I don't really like spending time with him, he's kind of crazy, he seems maybe kind of stuck up because he's related to Clive of India. But once they gave him Bradley's job, I think that's when Mason sort of really turned into the hater of Masculine that he is by the end of the book. But I don't think, like I had already said, I don't think that would be reflected in Masculine's opinion of him, because when they have their confrontation in 78, you can see that Masculine's very hurt by that, because it says specifically he turns away from Mason, and for the first time ever, he did not turn back. So it's clear that they have different opinions of each other, but certainly from Mason's perspective, no, I don't think there's any brotherly love or any other kind of love that is present there.
And that's what's weird to me is that Cherry Coke ostensibly has been telling the story the whole time. And he like when he says that, he sees it his brother, like, where do you get off even thinking that? Like, how this has gone down. Like, you're the one telling the story here. Right. This is anything but that. Like, so yeah, I thought that was interesting. I have to wonder if it's just Cherry Coke trying to be more genial and not knock someone of authority, I guess, in a way.
Some just leftover Christian upbringing.
Yeah, whatever little.
You shouldn't hate anybody.
Yeah.
Or it could certainly just be Pynchon continuing to develop this idea of, the people who tell history rarely have it correct. Because you're in this position where Cherry Coke, to your point, Cody, has been telling the story the whole time. Everything that we have read is ostensibly from his lips. So therefore, for him to come away with the wrong perspective, it could just be more of Pynchon saying, "See, even the people who tell us what our history is really have no fucking clue what they're talking about."
No, they wouldn't lie to us like that.
Yeah, it does seem to be a recurring theme in this book. Maybe not a theme, but a recurring plot point. As I think I went over, and Cody, I think, confirmed this, and other maybe Kate did too, that how frustrating it would be. It is, and to see somebody who is more or less your equal, or somebody that you think that you might even be better than, succeed in a field that you yourself are in. I did find him yelling at Masculine off-putting, although. Because Masculine comes across as such a he's a kind of a comedic character. I have trouble taking Masculine seriously, especially at the end, where he's wearing a wizard's robe or something. He has stars on his robe.
He's dressed like Mickey Mouse from Fantasia.
Yeah, that's the exact mental picture I got. What I'm saying? He just seems like some idiot that through familial connections and luck, just got ahead of Mason and stayed there.
Yeah, he's a nepo baby.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily his fault. I've had trouble taking him seriously throughout the book.
I don't think you're supposed to.
Yeah, and especially at the end with the description of his clothes. That being said, I mean, it is kind of off-putting for Mason. It kind of makes Mason come across as kids get off my lawn type old guy. That being said, I mean, it is, it does seem to be a long time coming, and I do think that, Mason, I could see myself having a similar reaction to somebody who, for years and years and years, probably, I imagine Masculine probably acted like he was better than Mason, although that's never stated or really in there.
He comes off that way.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm in my early to mid 30s. I do have some frustration with people I know that are in similar fields, in writing specifically, who have gotten more success than I have. I don't have that type of rivalry with any of them that Mason does have with Masculine, but if I did, I could see myself at an old age, perhaps letting the anger boil over and turn into real conflict. I don't necessarily know what it's like to have a lifetime of that kind of shit put on you, and that kind of a lifetime of more or less disappointment in terms of professional advancement. So I do find it understandable. It's just it doesn't reflect well on it. It doesn't make Mason a more sympathetic character to me. It makes him a less sympathetic character.
I see where you're coming from. I think it's more to take Mason's side on it. I think it's not just the fact that someone else is getting the success that he feels is deserved. It's that it's someone like Masculine. It's this goddamn wizard boy who, by all means should not have it and doesn't really seem to fully grasp what he has. Outside of the fact that he knows it's a powerful position, and so that's he kind of hams it up and lords it over him. But I don't necessarily I don't think Masculine is doing it intentionally. I think he's just aloof and unaware that it's in bad form to act the way he acts. I just think he doesn't see it as a problem. He's just being. I know people like that, and I think that's where it's like I see where Mason's coming from, because it sucks, especially when you really kind of know you can't do anything about it, or you shouldn't, and it just builds up for a long time.
Well, and I think Mason too would even be fine with Masculine being the Astronomer Royal if Bradley hadn't been. Like if Bradley hadn't been the Astronomer Royal, and if they had not had the relationship that they had, and if Mason had not been as invested in the observations that he'll never have a chance to get his credit on and like fully elucidate for everybody, I think maybe he would be able to swallow the fact that this total doofus has been put into the position. But because the last person to hold that chair was like, this person incredibly close to him and who he had studied under, with the connotation that maybe he would be the next one selected, combined with Masculine telling him, the Royal Society's not what it used to be. It's just, these quote unquote scientific people, and then the other half is macaronis, and like just so I think it's the combination of him denigrating the Royal Society, denying Mason entrance to the Royal Society year after year. The fact that he took over the chair after his closest friend, that kind of an outburst. I think that if you didn't have all three of them, perhaps Mason could just sort of swallow his pride and kind of deal with it. So and I
salt
think
on a wound.
And I think that once that scene happened where he finally kind of broke his reserve and let Masculine have it, like it released a tension that I didn't necessarily feel was there until that moment, where I was like, oh yeah, this has been like an undercurrent through most of the book, and Mason has never really done anything to defend himself or his friend's memory or the institution or whatever term you want to apply to it. He's just kind of constantly put his head down and said like, yes sir, no sir. And that wall kind of, maybe it was just the fucking wizard rope. Like he just saw him in that, and he's like, this is the last straw. I can't deal with this anymore.
Just red flashes in his eyes. And... oh man, I can't get that image out of my head.
It also makes that scene so much more ridiculous too.
It does.
He's verbally assaulting a man dressed like Mickey Mouse, and then that guy turns to face the other direction and doesn't turn around.
Oh man. Okay. Anything else we want to go over in 74?
Nothing comes to mind.
Okay. So hold on. I need a second. Oh god. It's so absurd.
It is.
Okay. So 75. I don't really have too much on this chapter. The first thing I wanted to bring up, I do love the scene where Dixon starts explaining about his journey to the North Pole and his discovery of the Hollow Earth, and how Mason gets immediately uncomfortable. Where it says, as Mason shifts uncomfortably and looks about for something to smoke or eat. And then later, Mason sits rhythmically inserting into his face an assortment of Meg Bland's cookies, tarts, and muffins, pretending to be silent by choice, lest any phrase emerge too farnaciously inflected. As someone who's been in those kind of conversations where I'm listening to someone talk about something that I just think is absolutely crazy, but I have to just kind of like grin and bear it, like that scene is hilarious to me. Just the uncomfortable looking around, trying to figure out what to do, and the only thing you can do is just put things into your mouth so you don't say something that you're going to regret saying.
Yeah, Dixon just started playing heroin at Mason while staring at him.
Thank you for bringing that memory back to me. Oh God.
So that's a reference to an episode a long time ago.
Yeah. Jeez. I'm gonna have nightmares about that situation. Maybe that's why I have trouble talking to people now.
Maybe that just sapped your ability to.
Yeah. It just took everything out of me. So the right after that, this is something I thought was interesting, and I wanted to get y'all's opinion on it. The Pension Wiki puts out this theory that Squire Halagast may be an expatriate of the Hollow Earth. And they're basing that on the last, I guess, paragraph or so of page 739. I'm not really sure how I feel about that, if there's really enough to say he is or isn't.
Yeah, that feels a bit grasping at straws to me.
There's a part later in, I want to say it's 77, maybe 78, where Benjamin Franklin's assistant is described as gnomish. I think that presents more of an argument that he's from the Hollow Earth. I don't think there's anything, I can't recall anything off the top of my head that would put Halagast as coming from Middle Earth. Jesus, I've been reading too much Tolkien. From the Hollow Earth. If any listeners have anything that they, if you agree with this, I would love to know where that is. Because the wiki doesn't provide any they link to like page 470 something, but I went back and read that whole page and the pages around it, and I still couldn't come upon how they got to that idea.
Can't say anything comes to mind at all. I mean, I think it's enough that Stig is from the Hollow Earth. That to also say that like these other kind of weird offbeat characters must also be from there. I don't know. That feels like you're trying to force something there. Because like if Squire Halagast was from the Hollow Earth, like what would that add?
Right.
Or affect his character in any way? Like I do anything. If anything else, it would make no sense why he would have all of his thoughts about the magical stuff that he sees on the surface, because he's from there.
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm curious if anybody knows, or not knows, but if anybody feels that that's the case, please send us something. I would love to hear an argument for that.
What did we think about the Hollow Earth stuff in general as it's included?
I rather liked it, and it's so. Just for context for our listeners, I was actually in Philadelphia this past weekend, and I don't like flying, so my go-to book whenever I have flown recently has been Against the Day. So I took that with me and got through about the first 200 pages, which that really heavily deals with the Hollow Earth in that book. So it's interesting to have that parallel between the two, because they both have entrances in the North Pole. It's way more fleshed out in Against the Day, but it's very similar to how it's presented in Mason and Dixon. And some of my favorite just prose from these chapters is tied to that description of the Hollow Earth. I really like the way that it's described, and the kind of curiosity of how one would adapt to living in the dynamic between living in the convex versus the concave, and shifting that kind of perspective around is just a really fascinating kind of thought experiment. But it's one of those things where that's one of the parts of the book that I wish was a little bit more fleshed out. But then I think that if that was it would, aside from feeling unnecessary, it would probably take away from the sort of magic of it, and which I think is necessary to kind of push that concept and that theme of the magic of the untouched parts of the earth. So to make that a more concise statement, I really liked it. It's some of the best writing in these chapters, and I wish there was more of it, but I don't.
One thing that struck me about that I've been thinking about today, about the Hollow Earth section, is that the Pynchon Wiki links the guy who guided Dixon into the Hollow Earth. The Pynchon Wiki implies, or I think states, that he could be an alien or that he has alien-like qualities. Which I have a few things I wanted to say about that. The Hollow Earth, it did remind me of the Book of the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe, which features like a circular spaceship that, like, when you look in the sky, you can like see a distant city on the same spaceship as you, which is a similar kind of feel to the Hollow Earth in this book. And the Book of the Long Sun books would have come out. I think the final one would have come out around the time Mason Dixon came out, which I find interesting, and I really love those books. The solar cycle, in my opinion, just gets better and better as the deeper into it you get. But the Book of the Long Sun, the spaceship on that I'm talking about, with the Yuke in the sky, and the sky is a distant part of the same general structure, is the people interpret the Book of the Long Sun spaceship as being a Dyson sphere, which I'm pretty sure that's what it is, a Dyson sphere, which I think is also featured in Interstellar, I want to say. The end of Interstellar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so the fact that the Pynchon Wiki links the guide, the person who leads him there, with the alien is interesting. There are some kind of aspects of, and I do think that this could be some type of weird, if you kind of really put on your Pepe Silva or whatever that meme is. If you do like the Charlie from Philadelphia, It's Always Sunny meme thing, you can make this whole argument that it's about alien abduction, and that he was really on a spaceship, a vast spaceship, which some of the dialogue kind of negates that. But there is, Mason at one point says, like, interjects when Dixon is telling the story. Mason says, that you can remember, which seems to imply to me the element of alien abduction. This is a bit of a tangent, but I have met one person who claims to have been abducted by aliens. It was a hitchhiker I picked up when I was in college and going through a really heavy Beat Generation phase. So I thought it was like the cool thing to do, to pick up hitchhikers and have them tell me their life story. I only did it like once or twice. But this old dude was talking about how he had been abducted by aliens in California in the 70s, and they had wiped his memory of the abduction. That's a pretty small part of that section, the Mason interjecting that the phrase "that you can remember." But I do think that that's in there, that is meant to be, you're supposed to kind of maybe be reminded of those kind of stories. And I do think that there is a possible aspect of alien abduction and kind of the general obsession with UFOs since the 1950s. That's definitely a big aspect of the counterculture, kind of sneaky big aspect of the counterculture in America for the last about 70 years.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and I do think I personally at least think that that's in there. I'm not 100%, but I would be surprised if when Pynchon was, he's never going to be interviewed, but if somebody did an interview with him and brought that up, I would be surprised if he dismissed it as completely false.
Hey, he could come on our show anytime. I'm
Yeah,
just saying, he's got a standing invitation. No, that's a good argument.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you clocked it, Luke, but Pynchon makes another reference to the process of turning from a journeyman into a master again in these 4 chapters. I don't remember what chapter it was in.
Oh, I do remember that. I didn't pick up on that being a New Sun reference, but yeah.
Yeah, so, and that was present like we mentioned earlier in the book as well, in an episode from several months ago. So I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there was at least some inspiration there. I think it's pretty clear that Pynchon read Wolfe and probably found his books interesting. But I think the Hollow Earth stuff is really interesting in this book. Obviously, as I now know from reading the Farm article, it does crop back up and against the day, and I think it's one of the few cases Pynchon is very explicitly explaining what he's doing, because there's the line that Dixon, with every long line of latitude and longitude that we map out, the opening gets smaller. Properly mapped out, the entirety of the world cease to exist. Everything there will die. So it's one case where he's not necessarily hiding the ball, so to speak, about what he's including this for. It's certainly a further elucidation of the stuff that Will was the one who said it, where we take away the je ne sais quoi of it all, we lose some aspect of the world or the inherent magic of untapped resource.
76, I want to say, is the shortest chapter in here.
It is, yeah. It's the Scotland thing.
Yeah, I don't really have too much. This is really just kind of the section where we have the meeting with Mason and Samuel Johnson and James Boswell. It was a fine chapter. I don't really have much to say on it, unfortunately. I really enjoyed the last paragraph of it. The Mason will go back to waking day after day in Sapperton, piecing together odd cash jobs for the Royal Society, reductions for Maskelyne's Almanac, small children everywhere, a neat observatory out in the garden, a reputation in the Golden Valley as a sorcerer, apprentice, who once climbed that strange eminence at Greenwich up into another level of power, sailed to all parts of the globe, but came back down among them. Again, they will say they will be easy with him, call him Charlie at last. Another small town eccentric absorbed back into the weavery, keeping a workspace fitted out someplace in the back of some long Cotswold house, down a chain of rooms back from the lane and out onto the crooked looming of those hillside fields. That was a great ending to that chapter. But other than that, I really truly just don't have much to go over on this particular chapter.
Yeah, no, I didn't either.
I was somewhat confused by I think it's this chapter where there's a reference to cannibalism as it relates to Scotland. I want to say it's in there that, and I didn't necessarily understand that. And the Pynchon Wiki doesn't have any explainers. Maybe we'll have to ask Brett if he has anything on it. But I was somewhat confused by that reference.
Do you have the quote?
I'm looking for it now.
Let me get my book 1 second.
While Luke's looking for that, I did forget that there was a pretty good part in here where they dunk on Cherry Coke again. Where I had my Boswell.
Right.
I had my Boswell once. Mason tells Boswell, Dixon and I, we had a joint Boswell, preacher named Cherry Coke, scribbling everything down just like you, sir. Have you, twirling his hand in ellipses, ever had one yourself, if I'm not prying? And it's just like these dunks on Cherry Coke are just so much better when we remember that he's telling the story and he's choosing to include these times where they're just shitting all over him.
Or could be just making them up, which would be even crazier.
It's on 745. Soon he will commence with the cannibalism jokes. Pray you, miss it not. 'Tis more hilarious than may at first seem likely. I didn't know if there was some example of people from Scotland like doing cannibalism at some point. I don't know if it maybe even goes back to the Romans or something. I don't know.
The first thing that comes up if you just consult Google is a Wikipedia article about someone named Sawney Bean, where it says Alexander Sawney Bean was said to be the head of a 45-member clan in Scotland in the 16th century that murdered and cannibalized over 1,000 people in 20 years.
Holy shit.
According to legend, Bean and his clan members were eventually caught by a servant sent by King James VI and executed for their heinous crimes.
Yeah, that'll probably be it. I mean, it fits the time
Okay.
period.
Yeah, definitely. Because King James VI would have been a little bit beforehand, maybe. Yeah, he died in 1625, so certainly beforehand. But if for some reason that had innervated into the culture as a joke. But yeah, 1,000 people in 25 years. That's prolific.
Yeah. That's well, moving on to chapter 77. This is the chapter, as much as 78 emotionally was heavy, 77 got me more than 78. I think the combination of Dixon's dream, the two of them doing their little song and dance routine, is just so wholesome and just really sweet. And the song is great. It just really is such a nice sort of almost like a cap on their time together. And this is how Dixon's kind of romanticizing or idealizing their relationship, is that they kind of go out on this, showman's note, or they're just having a good time up on stage and entertaining other people and just enjoying each other's presence and company. And then you couple that with Dixon knowing that he's going to die soon, like openly understanding that this is going to happen. And then the end of the chapter with their fishing together is, I mean, it's wonderful. And it really just, that's the part that really wrecked me. Just knowing what was coming and seeing them spend these last, I don't know, days together, however long they had together. And just, I think this chapter, I think, really summarizes, I think, the whole, I'm stumbling over my words here. I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this. Like, it really epitomizes relationship, and it really, this is I think the perfect way to say goodbye to these two. Even though we're not really saying goodbye to them just yet, I think this is that nice final scene of them together.
The relationship that's been in anything that he's ever read. And while I don't have experience with that firsthand, certainly popular culture would say that, like, it takes a long time for male friends to admit to each other that they like each other and become sincere.
Sadly, that's true. I mean,
yeah. And so getting to see that happen was really, it was very emotionally. The earnestness that the two of them have towards each other is such a sudden change, and it feels well earned, and it feels but there's also a sadness to it that they don't have more time together, and that they couldn't have been more honest with one another, prior to this happening.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most heartbreaking part of all of this, is that they've spent years together at this point.
Yeah.
And it's taken them that long to be able to really, it's not even that they articulate it, because there's a scene earlier in, I don't remember what chapter it is off the top of my head now, but where there's just a real brief part where Mason puts his hand on Dixon's shoulder, and it's like, that's like the first time they've ever been that physically close with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it only lasts for a moment, and then it's gone. And it's, as you mentioned, that is really and truly a societal thing. And I hate that it is, but there's always been this kind of stigma that men cannot have a platonic love for each other. That we're supposed to be above that. We're supposed to be have this tough facade that we wear all the time and not show our emotions. And it sucks because these two really truly care about each other, but they just, neither of them really feels like they can show it until years later, and they're both about to die.
Yeah.
And even then, it's, they're not really explicitly saying anything. It's just shown through their actions, time together. But it's shown beautifully.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's additionally sad is like Mason wouldn't have gone and seen him without Masculine more or less forcing him to do it.
Yeah.
Which is another case where Masculine probably views their relationship significantly differently than Mason does. Because Mason wasn't going to, and Masculine basically said like, "Oh, I put another day on your itinerary, Dixon, because you'll be going through that area." And then he goes, "Oh no, I can just keep going. Oh, you should stop." like he essentially forces him to go speak to Dixon, and then Dixon more or less stay at it, just continuing on. So even though that is how they feel about each other, it still requires outside to push Mason to engage. And it isn't until Mason realizes time he is more willing to admit that he wants to see him.
It's just it's a really touching conclusion to their time together, and I would be lying if I said it didn't make me cry a little. It's just very moving.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Luke, did you have anything you wanted to add on 77?
Not really. I mean, it is an enjoyable chapter. Like I liked what y'all said about the friendship thing, and the I hate musicals in general. With very,
I do too. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, with very few exceptions. But it was kind of fun to picture Mason and Dixon performing that song on stage. It was just kind of a fun mental image for me.
Yeah, I didn't. I'm with you on the musical thing. I think to me that read more as like the old comedy duos of the 30s and 40s, where they would have musical numbers in there every now and then, and usually their set would finish with like a musical number that wasn't really necessarily funny, but it was more just like a sweet kind of song to end on. But either way, it's a good song. I think it's probably one of the better songs in the book. But yeah, I really liked it.
Can I ask what the exceptions are to Luke's musicals that he likes?
I'm curious because I have I can probably name 3 musicals I like. So I'm curious if any of them are the same ones I have.
Some Like It Hot is the main one I was thinking of.
Okay.
I actually enjoyed that movie a fair amount. Pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting because the one, aside from one of mine, the other 2 I would think it's a bit of a stretch to call them musicals, but I really liked, if this is going to be an obscure one, if anybody's a South Park fan, Cannibal the Musical was really funny and really good. I count it as musical because it's in the title. And the other one is the South Park movie. Also, I consider that a musical. And then Hamilton. I genuinely love Hamilton. I do. My family got me onto that a few years ago, and that's our 4th of July thing every year. It's
every year.
It's what we do.
Okay,
that's our thing. Yeah. So those are mine. Other than that, I can't I can suspend my disbelief for really just about anything, but I cannot do it. I just can't have a group of people burst into choreographed song and dance. I just, as a musician, I know too many people, and I know large groups of people cannot keep time. So I sincerely cannot believe that they can sing in key together on time while dancing. Just doesn't work for me.
Gotcha.
But that's
I would be the odd one out, and then I do enjoy musicals.
Sorry. I mean, to each their own. I'm not
Yeah,
gonna.
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's tackle this last chapter. It's. I think we talked a lot about its efficacy as a final chapter. So we can circle back to that at the end here, but I do want to just bring up a few things that I really did enjoy about it. Particularly the scene where Mason does finally visit Dixon's grave. That one, I think I mentioned earlier that I really liked how it's very short, and I appreciate that about it, because I feel like this is the kind of scene where a lot of other authors would have drawn this scene out and would have tried to make this whole long scene about it and really try to just extend as much as they can about it. But this, I mean, it's 3 paragraphs altogether, and it's exactly what it needs to be. And I absolutely love the very last line. It's your mate, Dr. Isaac assured him. It's what happens when your mate dies. That just it summarizes that, again, that male bond and that friendship that they have, and his son has to tell him, like, it's okay to grieve. It's okay that you feel this way. This man was your friend. You loved this man, and he's gone. So absolutely, yes, feel this way, because it's normal. It's natural. It's what you should be feeling right now.
Yeah, definitely. And that same quote is certainly the one that stuck out to me as well. Just the quiet impact that a statement like that has is really powerful in these chapters. But I also liked that the journey that Doc and Mason have kind of mirrors some of the same things that Mason and Dixon did in America. Just like the kind of going to taverns and walking along these different pathways with these different landscapes and everything. Like I really enjoyed the kind of symmetry there. He did it once with somebody that he formed an intense bond with, and now he's doing the same thing again with a child that he hopes to have the same sort of intensity and bond with now.
And I think that's what Mason needs. You know, we talked earlier about his finally getting over Rebecca's death, and it took this long. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that he didn't have anyone else to fill that void. And now, this other major person in his life is gone, but he's allowing someone else to come and step into that and to fill that void. And he, not only that, but he's also, now he has his relationship with his son that he never had with his father. So for Mason, this is, I think, a really huge step forward for him. And I kind of wish that we could get more of his life after this happens, and more of his time with his son, and see how he grows in that relationship with him. But again, the story has to end, and we have to be good with it. So I'm glad that it at least is there, so that we know, as a reader, we can kind of fill in that gap and know that he has that time, and that he will get to experience that relationship, if only for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I do really love that he finally opens up about Rebecca to his son. Definitely is one of those took you long enough type situations.
Yeah.
I can't really imagine. I mean, I have some experience with family members dying, but nobody as important as a mother. There were some. My dad had a sister die before I was born and stuff that I've asked questions about that he doesn't necessarily bring up that much, but it was while he was a kid. but he's always been pretty open to me asking questions about her. Yeah, I don't. It'd be very odd to go your whole life basically without knowing much about the person that birthed you. I also really like the part where Doc, I forget what the kid's name is, but Doc or whatever,
Dr. Isaac.
Yeah, Dr. Isaac is scared that he was named after the doctor that that was involved with his mom's death. Which is definitely the type of thing that, you know, a child is gonna internalize that kind of stuff. You know, like children will often blame themselves for stuff that has nothing to do with them. I have some experience with that in a few different ways. You know, I enjoyed that. It definitely humanizes I think they're probably teenagers at this point or early 20s. Definitely humanizes his two older boys. The fact that the one is so insecure about it and that the other one is so nice and reassuring. Because I'm sure, you know, with their mom passed away and their dad constantly absent, they probably had to learn to rely on each other a little bit more than most siblings would. I found that very touching, and I do kind of like. While I wish that they had played a bigger part in the novel as a whole, you know, it is stated that Mason had been kind of running away from them, and them being. It's not stated, but it's implied, at least to me, that him running away from them is related to Rebecca and them reminding him of Rebecca, how he like looks in their face and sees Rebecca and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I like this chapter probably more than y'all do. So
then we get Mason learning about the discovery of Uranus, which that section, that paragraph is one of my favorites in these chapters. The way it's described is his inability to really enjoy the experience of the discovery, just due to all the circumstances that have come before it, and how that all plays out in his mind is absolutely beautifully written.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also additionally interesting given that we know he would have discovered Uranus if they had pushed past the warrior path.
Yeah. I feel like he knows that somewhere in the back of his mind that could have been his.
Yeah, I agree.
It won't be. So then, I mean, not long after that, Mason, has his kind of final moments and his kind of final interactions with Maskelyne and Ben Franklin.
I feel like we should just read that out.
Do you want to?
What page is it on?
771.
771. Because I mean, we've made enough references to it at this point.
It deserves a good going over.
Maskelyne understood that Maskelyne understood that Mason meant not there upon the Royal Society Council. His parsonical scowl dropped from forehead to eyes as we clench our face sometimes against sentiment. No records survive, however, of when Neville Maskelyne did or did not weep. What he did do now was turn away from Mason, and for the first time and the last time, not turn back to face him. The last Mason saw of him was the back of his wig. The next year, after several dramatic votes and skirmishes, though not all that many stick-enhanced injuries, everyone in the Royal Society ended most frightful chums, and Maskelyne was back on the council, remaining so thereafter, year upon year, until his passing.
I gotta feel bad for the guy. I mean, as we talked about, to have everything you've done undermined and overshadowed by someone like Maskelyne.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, that sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then we have Mason's final scene where he's talking with Franklin and with his new wife, Mary. But then for me, I and again we talked about this. The last paragraph is just absolutely perfect. Throughout, in spite of this chapter's stronger and weaker points, I do think this last paragraph is truly the best ending we could have gotten. There's nothing I would change about it.
Yeah, I'm certainly not, I don't hate it, but as I mentioned at the top of the show, I feel like it could potentially be organized a bit better. But
well, unless anybody has anything else, I think that does it for 74 through 78. Let's talk about funny stuff, because there was some pretty good humorous scenes in these chapters. I did like when they were talking about I forgot to put the page number on it. It was in chapter 74 when they were talking about the bog. Damn it, my brain tonight, I swear. The bog burst. When it started happening again, and then there was the line, "Look out, here comes what, a repeat?" Stupid pun, but those always work for me.
I think my most funny part, I'm having trouble finding it right now, but it's the part where he talks about like I've ascended and descended and all this stuff, but I've never transcended.
Oh yeah, that was good.
Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah.
I think also the inclusion that when Mason is talking to Masculine, he says, "Well, you're the AR," and he over pronounces the R like a pirate for some reason. That was another one that stood out to me, other than just the absurd stuff that Mason was trying to put into his logs.
Yeah. I think all in all, though, I didn't have this in my notes because I hadn't tracked it at the time, but Luke's mention of the row, fucking Masculine's row. I think that does it for me. That's
fair. That might actually almost be the most pinch-on part of these chapters too.
It might, yeah.
Yeah. Generally, all the descriptions of costumes in this last section, or clothes, I guess. It's very garish and over the top.
Yeah. Well, shall we go into quotes then?
Sure.
We don't have Will. No one can steal from Will, so we can just say we all stole Will's quote.
I was just going to say, and maybe none of us stole from Will, but also maybe all of us did.
Exactly. Kate, do you want to go first?
Sure. My quote comes from page 771, where it says, "Whilst I'm of use," Mason says, "they shan't seek my dissolution. Not in the thick of this dispute over the Bradley obs, so-called, these being many of them my own. No one wants to repeat what went on between Newton and Flamsteed, excepting perhaps one of the Kabbalistic turn, who believes those arrays of numerals to be the magical text that will deliver him to immortality, or suspects that Bradley found something as important as the aberration, but more ominous. Something France may not have, or not right away, and Jesuits must not learn of ever. Something so useful and deadly that rather than publish his suspicions or even reduce the data any further, Bradley simply left them as an exercise for anyone strongly enough interested. And what could that be? What phantom shape implicit in the figures? Ah, you old quizzer." Franklin tries to beam, Mason continuing to regard him, not pleading, but as if it didn't matter much what Franklin thinks. "'Tis a construction," Mason said weakly. "Single great engine the size of a continent. I have all the proofs you may require. Not all the connections are made yet, but that's why some of it is still invisible. Day by day, the pioneers and surveyors go on. More points are being tied in and soon becoming visible as above. New stars are recorded and named and placed in almanacs. You found it, have ye? This certainly isn't that curious design with the trifling cost that you sent me along with your letter. Sir, you have encountered deists before, and know that our Bible is nature, wherein the Pentateuch is the sky. I have found there written every night in astral gematria messages of great urgency to our time and your continent, sir." I pick that set of dialogue between Mason and Franklin because I think it completes another part of Mason's character in that he's now comfortable proclaiming himself a deist, as he does at the end there, which feels like a sort of final evolution to his religious struggles through the course of this book. But I think it also speaks to a lot of the broader thematic content of this book as a whole, because Mason is laying out this idea that there is an interwoven fabric of religion and mathematics and astronomy and, you know, nature and the land that all fits together to create something. And it's something that he would be afraid of the existing religious orders having access to or even knowing about. It's something that if you seek, you may find if you look for it. And finally, he's referring to it as this great engine, which could very much be a reference to the deistic idea of how God sort of created a clock and then set it to run and then ran away. But it could also speak to something significantly more, you know, mind-melting, like Luke's theory about potentially references to a Dyson sphere or other things. But it feels like this beautiful synthesis of so many of the different thematic aspects that this book is running along, where you finally have this man who's been confused about religion and his work professionally, and these different kind of crazy characters that he's met along the way that have these different interpretations of the world, and also his mentor in the past and all of that, sort of finally fitting together in an explanation that's good enough for him. And he's finally reached a point where he's no longer so confused and scattered. And so that was why I picked it. It feels like kind of one of those last final moments where Mason finally becomes the person he's been trying to become, albeit very late in his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a final catharsis for him. It's kind of the last thing he needed to come to terms with.
Yeah.
Luke, what do you have?
So mine is the first paragraph on 726. I thought about the last paragraph on 725 because it's also pretty good. But yeah, so it reads, "Now nothing in the sky looks the same. As to the comet, I cannot account for how, but there came this night to this boggy miasmatic place, an exceptional clarity of the air, a sort of optical tension among the stars that seemed ever just about to break radiantly through, and there, in Leo bright-maned, lo, it came ahead, and 'twould be but prelude to the finger of Corsica, which now appeared, pointing down from heaven, and the place where it pointed was the place I knew I must journey to, for beneath the sky-born index lay as once beneath a star, an infant that must again remake the world, and this time 'twas a sign from earth, not only from heaven, showing the way."
That's a great paragraph. I had that one picked as well. So mine, as I mentioned earlier, I really the prose that was used when describing the Hollow Earth, and so I've selected. It starts at the end of 739, when Dixon is explaining his journey to the North Pole. The ice giving way to tundra, we proceeded, ever downhill, into a not quite total darkness, the pressure of the air slowly increasing, each sound soon taking on a whispering aftertone, as from some sort of immense composite echo, until we were well inside, hundreds of miles below the outer surface, having clung to what we now walked upon quite handily all the way, expecting that we'd arrived upside down as bats in a belfry. The interior had remained less studied philosophically than endured anxiously by those who might choose to travel diametrically across it, means of flight having been developed early in the history of the inner surface. Their god, like that of the Iroquois, lives at their horizon. Here it is their north or south horizon, each a more and less dim ellipse of skylight. The curve of the rim is illuminated, depending on the position of the sun, in greater or lesser relievo. Chains of mountains, thin strokes of towers, the eternally spilling lives of thousands dwelling in the long estuarial towns, wrapping from outside to inside as the water rushes away in uncommonly long waterfalls, downward for hours, unbraked, till at last debouching into an interior lake of great size, upside down but perfectly secured to its lake bed by gravity as well as centrifugal force, and in which upside down swimmers glide at perfect ease, hanging over an abyss thousands of miles deep. From wherever one is, to raise one's eyes is to see the land and water rise ahead of one and behind as well, higher and higher till lost in the thickening of the atmosphere. In the larger sense, then, to journey anywhere in this terra concava is to ever ascend, with its corollary, outside here upon the convexity, to go anywhere is ever to descend. So yeah, I just love the descriptions of the Hollow Earth in this book, and in Against the Day as well, but obviously this one came first. It's, you know, again, we've talked before that, you know, Pynchon's ability to write nature scenes is one of his, I think, stronger writing parts. God, that's a terrible sentence. His writing, when it comes to, I think, above most other writers. I think he has an eloquence that he can describe these scenes so poetically, without getting too flowery and without really leaving too much out. It's a well balanced writing style, specifically when he's doing these kind of nature scenes. And I think it's really interesting when he inverts that nature. Have these lakes that are on the ceiling and waterfalls that go on for hours, convexity versus a concavity. It's absolutely beautiful writing, and probably one of my favorite parts of these 4 chapters.
Yeah, it's a great choice. It's some of the best writing in these sections.
Well, what do we feel is the most Pynchon part of this last part of the book?
I mean, now that I've suggested that it's the robe, I feel
that's where I'm going with it too.
like it would be wrong to pick anything else.
Yeah, I didn't have anything in my notes for it because I just couldn't nail down one part, and I was like, as we talk about it, I'll figure out. And we did. We figured it out.
We did. We did.
It's
Masculine is Mickey Mouse.
He's the wizard from the, was it Cookie Crisp cereal?
Yep.
So.
If only he had a magic wand.
Yeah. Luke, do you have a different most Pynchon part?
No. I mean, I guess we already kind of went over it, but yeah, the different clothes and costumes.
Yeah. Well, that's it, guys. We finished Mason and Dixon.
We did.
It took us 5 months. We've been talking about this, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's been great. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we will be doing a capstone covering the whole book and our general feelings on it, and if anybody's opinion on it has changed as a result of this reading. So I think I can speak for all of us when I say, you know, we would love for any listeners to let us know, has your opinion on this book changed as a result of rereading it and going through this with us? Do you like it more? Do you like it less? Do you feel like the things that maybe you didn't catch the first time or the second time or the third time or however many times you've read this before, do those add anything fundamental to your understanding of the book, or your what you come away with it? Anything that you feel about it, let us know, and we'll share it on our next episode next week. So until then, thank you all so much for listening. Check us on our social media stuff. It's all in the show notes and everything, and we'll see everyone next week.
See ya.
Bye. I am almost done with guards.
Oh yeah, how are you liking it? That sigh has me curious where this is going.
I can perfectly understand why people really like Pratchett. And
Okay.
I'm not going to say that I dislike it. I'm not going to say that I dislike him. I'm not going to say that I dislike the book, because I don't. I think it is funny. It has the same sort of brand of British humor as like Hitchhiker's Guide and Neil Gaiman, when Neil Gaiman is trying to be dryly funny, or like Monty Python or things like that. So that when the humor does show up, I think it's pretty good. And I like the degree of world building that he goes into to try and make Ankh-Morpork feel like a real place, for the Discworld to feel like a real place. Like him having consistent mentions of like street names and places on those streets and what they are to the society are really good. My biggest complaint is it doesn't always feel like he knows how to move his story along.
That's fair.
Like it feels like a lot of individual scenes that are really entertaining and are oftentimes really funny, but that he lacks some ability to connect them in a continuous evolution to get to where the story is supposed to be going. And that is my biggest complaint with Guards, where it kind of just feels like a lot of stuff is happening, and then eventually it ends up here, and it isn't necessarily clear or perhaps well laid out how all of that got to that point.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. I think I definitely see where you're coming from, more so now that I'm rereading Hitchhiker's Guide, because I think this may be a broad generalization here, but I think that is maybe more indicative of British humor, that type of British humor, especially because you did mention Monty Python and Douglas Adams. The like Hitchhiker's Guide itself, the first book, is great through and through. Wonderful book. The later books, because I'm like halfway through Life, the Universe, and Everything right now, and I remember most of the other two books, but they suffer from that same problem of just feeling more like these very loosely interconnected stories that don't necessarily have a whole lot of plot going for them, but there's enough of it to keep you engaged and have it not feel like just a series of vignettes. Monty Python did the same thing too. I think it worked to greater success with Holy Grail. Life of Brian was totally different because that was a very much plot driven story, but Meaning of Life suffered that same kind of thing where it was just more interconnected stories that loosely tied through a theme. So I think it may just be, and I've read some of why am I blanking on his name? Terry Jones. Him and Douglas Adams wrote a book together. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head now, but it suffered from that same kind of problem. So I'm curious, and other Pratchett I've read has the same thing too. So I'm curious if that's just a British humor writing situation where they're more focused on just humorous scenes and not so much on plot. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I'm curious. I want to read more of it. Like I'm looking forward to reading Small Gods, and
Small Gods is great.
I really also want to read the Death series, because Death has shown up in Guards, it has been some of my favorite stuff.
That's
just that whole scene. I guess spoilers for people who haven't read a book from what is Guards 1999 or whatever.
Maybe later, maybe earlier. Yeah.
The scene where the dragon has started to actually take control of the rituals and is like no longer being controlled by the Supreme Grandmaster. And all of them are trying, like all of the other members of the cult are talking amongst themselves about how something doesn't feel right. And Death is occasionally interjecting in there because it's in all caps.
Yeah.
And then eventually when they do die, just his like dryly sarcastic response to everybody when they die and he's the first person they see. That kills me every time he appears. So I really want to read the books where he is the main character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just picked up a copy of Guards the other day. Like $4.
Have you read it before?
No.
Okay. I
I
want
think
to
the
hear
only
your thoughts on
Pratchett
it too.
I've read is like the first 100 pages of Good Omens.
Okay. I liked Good Omens. It was good.
I should have finished it. I just was going through stuff at that time and just never.
Yeah, it's understandable. It's
Yeah, I'll
I
be curious what your experience is like, Luke, if it's similar to mine or not.
yeah, now I want to go back and read Good Omens again. I tried to watch the show. I couldn't get as into it. I have a problem with watching shows like closely after reading the source book
Mm-hmm.
because it just like I tried to watch Preacher after I read that series for like the 5th time,
Oh, sure.
and I just couldn't like I loved that graphic novel so much. I could never get into the show because it just never had the same didn't have the same feel, and I didn't get the impression that they were going to take the same chances with a lot of the really edgy parts of that series.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they can get away with some of that stuff on TV, no matter what
Oh, yeah, definitely
cable
not.
channel they're on.
Yeah. I mean, so as someone who is also a very big fan of Preacher and did watch the show, it is about as good of an adaptation as you can get for what that series is. All three of the main characters are excellently cast. And
I did like that. They were
they were all, and like their performance through the whole thing is incredibly well done.
I may have to go back to it.
Yeah, so
How many seasons did it run?
4 or 5.
Okay,
They completed it.
that's good. At least they got to do that. Why the Last Man never got to do that, and that still bothers me.
4 seasons.
Okay. Yeah, because I forgot that Steve Dillon died not too long ago. No, it was longer. It was a while back, wasn't it?
Steve Dillon's death.
Yeah, 2016. I don't know why I thought it was like 2020.
A lot of people died in 2016.
That's yeah, 2016 and 17.
The other Discworld book that I want to read quite a bit is Monstrous Regiment.
I've not read that one.
I think I picked that one up too. I think that one was one I found the other day too.
It was there was a TERF who was trying to say that Terry Pratchett would be an anti-trans individual if he was still alive. Which I think is really funny if you know anything about Terry Pratchett. But one of the people who was articulating why this couldn't be true used Monstrous Regiment as an example of it. Because if you don't know what it's about, Cody, it is a division of soldiers from Borogravia that are all secretly women, quote unquote, pretending to be men. And there's obviously a lot of humor in the main character discovering that this is the case, like the longer the book goes on. But there are some really amazing sections from it that this person who is articulating Terry Pratchett's view, what Terry Pratchett's views on trans people likely would be, where he was pulling from that book in the way that it deals with gender and identification and the way that people refer to themselves or want to be perceived. That seemed very, very interesting.
Yeah, I hate that someone would make that declaration about him, and I from what I know about Pratchett, he doesn't seem like the type that would do like, a complete heel turn like John Cleese. So I would like to think that he would, he seemed like a genuinely good person who cared about pretty much everybody. So